Captain Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cool metal of the Apache helicopter's window, watching the desert landscape roll beneath them like an endless brown carpet. The morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and orange, but she barely noticed the beauty. Her mind was focused on the mission briefing that had woken her at 0400 hours. Viper 2-1, this is base. Radio check. Over. Crackled through her headset. Base. Viper 2-1. Loud and clear. Sarah responded, her voice steady, despite the knot in her stomach. She glanced at her weapons officer, Lieutenant Jake Thompson, seated behind her in the tandem cockpit. Even through the reflection in her helmet visor, she could see his concentration as he studied the tactical display. The intelligence reports had been troubling. Enemy forces had been moving through the valley ahead, using the rocky terrain to hide supply convoys and weapons caches. 3 previous reconnaissance flights had detected unusual activity, but each time the helicopters arrived, they found nothing but empty desert. It was as if the enemy knew exactly when they were coming. Sarah's Apache, designated Viper 2-1, was part of a 2-ship formation. Captain Mike Rodriguez flew Viper 2-2, 50 meters to her right. They had trained together for months, developing the kind of trust that kept pilots alive in hostile territory. Mike was steady, reliable, and had saved her life more than once during their deployment. Sarah, you seeing anything on thermal? Jake asked, through the internal comm system. She scanned her forward-looking infrared display, searching for heat signatures that might indicate human activity. The desert was surprisingly cold in the early morning, making warm bodies stand out like beacons. Negative, nothing but rocks and sand so far. The mission was supposed to be routine. Intelligence suggested this was another empty run, but Sarah had learned never to trust routine in a combat zone. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her that the moment you got comfortable was the moment the enemy struck. She kept his voice in her head during every flight. Stay sharp, stay alive. The 2 Apaches flew in a loose formation, maintaining altitude and speed as they approached the target area. Below them, the terrain grew more rugged, with deep ravines and towering rock formations that could hide an army. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as they entered what the briefing had called the area of interest. Viper flight, this is Overwatch, came a new voice over the radio. Somewhere high above them, an unmanned drone was providing surveillance, its cameras scanning the ground with electronic eyes that could spot movement from incredible distances. Go ahead, Overwatch, Mike responded. We're seeing some possible movement in Grid Square Echo 7. Thermal signatures are faint, but there's definitely something down there. Sarah checked her GPS coordinates and found Echo 7 on her map. It was a narrow canyon with steep walls, the kind of place that could hide vehicles or personnel, but it was also the kind of place that could hide surface-to-air missiles. Copy that, Overwatch. Viper flight is moving to investigate. The 2 helicopters changed course, their rotors beating the air with a distinctive whop-whop-whop that echoed off the canyon walls. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of adrenaline as they approached the target. Every sense was heightened, every instrument reading crucial. I've got movement, Jake called out suddenly. Thermal contact, bearing 270. Looks like vehicles. Possibly 3 or 4. Sarah looked where he indicated and saw the heat signatures on her display. They were definitely vehicles, and they were moving through the canyon in what looked like a convoy. This was exactly what they had been looking for. Viper 2-2, do you have eyes on target? Affirmative, 2-1. I count 4 vehicles. Looks like trucks or possibly armored personnel carriers. Sarah's training took over as she maneuvered the Apache into a better attack position. The helicopter's 30mm chain gun was loaded and ready, and the Hellfire missiles hung like sleeping wasps under the aircraft's stub wings. But something felt wrong. The convoy was moving too openly, too obviously. In her experience, enemy forces in this area were usually more careful about concealment. Jake, what do you think? This seems almost too easy. Her weapons officer was studying his targeting systems, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I don't know, Sarah. The signatures look legitimate, but you're right. Something feels off. The rules of engagement were clear. They needed positive identification before engaging any targets. Sarah switched to her modernized target acquisition designation site, a sophisticated system that combined television and thermal imaging. Through the powerful lens, she could see the vehicles more clearly. They were definitely military trucks, painted in desert camouflage and moving in tactical formation. But as she watched, she noticed something strange. The vehicles seemed to be following a very specific route, almost as if they were being guided. Most convoys in hostile territory moved erratically, changing direction frequently to avoid predictable patterns. Overwatch, Viper 2-1. Can you confirm hostile intent on these vehicles? Something doesn't look right. There was a pause before the drone operator responded. Viper 2-1. Intelligence indicates this is a high-value convoy carrying weapons and supplies to enemy forces in the region. You are cleared to engage. Sarah felt her finger hover over the trigger controls, but the nagging doubt persisted. She had been flying combat missions for 8 months, and her instincts had kept her alive this long. She trusted them more than she trusted intelligence reports. Mike, are you getting the same feeling I am about this? Roger that, Sarah. This whole setup feels like a trap. The word trap sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She had heard stories from other pilots about ambushes in these mountains. Surface-to-air missiles hidden in caves, waiting for helicopters to get close enough to engage ground targets. The enemy had learned that the best way to shoot down an Apache was to make it think it was attacking something valuable. Viper Flight, this is base. We're showing you in the target area. What's your status? Sarah made a decision that would save their lives. Instead of immediately engaging the convoy, she decided to make a high-speed pass to get a better look. It was a risky move, but her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. 2-2, let's make a fast pass from the north. Stay high and keep your eyes open for any SAM sites. Copy that, 2-1. Following your lead, the two Apaches banked sharply and accelerated, their turbine engines whining as they climbed to a safer altitude. Sarah's eyes swept the canyon walls, looking for any sign of hidden weapons or personnel. The thermal imaging showed several hot spots that could be vehicle engines or equipment, but they were positioned too perfectly along the convoy route. As they made their pass, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. She spotted the telltale heat signature of a missile launcher, partially concealed in a cave entrance about halfway up the canyon wall. Then, she saw another one, and another. The entire canyon was a kill zone, designed to trap helicopters at low altitude. Jake, are you seeing this? Jesus, Sarah. There must be half a dozen SAM sites down there. We need to get out of here now. But even as she spoke, her threat warning system began screaming. Someone had locked onto them with radar, and missile launches were imminent. The convoy hadn't been the real target. It had been bait, designed to draw them into range of the surface-to-air missiles. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, throwing the Apache into evasive maneuvers that would have made her instructors proud. The helicopter rolled and dived, its systems automatically dispensing chaff and flares to confuse incoming missiles. Through her headset, she could hear Mike's Apache doing the same dance of survival. The first missile streaked past them, its exhaust trail visible as a white line against the blue sky. Sarah pulled the helicopter into a tight turn, feeling the G-forces press her into her seat. The Apache was incredibly agile for its size, but surface-to-air missiles were faster. "Missile in the air," Jake called out, his voice tight with concentration as he worked his countermeasures. Sarah saw the second missile climbing toward them and knew they were in serious trouble. But instead of panic, she felt a strange sense of clarity. All her training, all her experience, had prepared her for this moment. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she had trained to do. The mission had become something entirely different from what they had planned. Instead of hunting the enemy, they had become the hunted. But Sarah Martinez had not survived 8 months of combat flying by giving up easily. She keyed her radio to broadcast on the emergency frequency. "Any friendly aircraft, this is Viper 2-1. We are taking fire from multiple SAM sites in Grid Square Echo 7. Immediate air support requested." As another missile launch lit up her threat warning system, Sarah smiled grimly inside her helmet. The enemy had set their trap perfectly, But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the skill and determination of the Apache pilots they were trying to kill. The real battle was just beginning, and Captain Sarah Martinez had no intention of making it easy for them. She had been trained by the best pilots in the world, and she was flying one of the most advanced attack helicopters ever built. If the enemy wanted a fight, she was more than ready to give them one. The desert morning that had started so peacefully was about to become a test of everything she had learned about survival, courage, and the deadly art of aerial combat. The outcome would depend not just on technology and training, but on the kind of fighting spirit that had kept aviators alive in hostile skies for generations. Sarah's father had been right. The moment you got comfortable was the moment the enemy struck. But he had also taught her something else. When the enemy strikes, you strike back harder. As the missiles climbed toward her aircraft, Captain Sarah Martinez prepared to prove that lesson once again. The third surface-to-air missile shot up from the canyon like an angry hornet, its smoke trail twisting as it tried to follow Sarah's violent, evasive maneuvers. She pulled the Apache into a dive that made her stomach drop, then hauled back on the controls to level out just above the canyon floor. The missile sailed overhead, confused by the sudden altitude change. "That was too close," Jake shouted over the intercom, his voice strained as the G-forces pressed against him. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was too busy analyzing the tactical situation with the cold precision that had kept her alive through dozens of combat missions. The enemy had positioned their missile sites perfectly, covering all the obvious escape routes. But they had made the classic mistake of assuming their prey would react predictably. "Mike, what's your status?" she called to her wingman as she watched another heat signature bloom on her threat display. "Still flying, but barely. I count at least 6 active SAM sites. These guys aren't amateurs." Captain Rodriguez's voice was calm despite the circumstances, and Sarah felt a surge of confidence. Mike had been flying combat missions even longer than she had, and his steady presence gave her something to anchor her tactics around. The convoy below had stopped moving, which confirmed Sarah's suspicion that it had been nothing more than bait. The real purpose of this operation was becoming clear. The enemy wanted to shoot down American helicopters, and they had prepared an elaborate trap to do it. "Overwatch, this is Viper 2-1. We have multiple SAM sites active in the canyon. The convoy was a decoy. Repeat, the convoy was a decoy." The drone operator's voice came back immediately, tight with concern. "Copy that, Viper 2-1. We're seeing the missile launches on thermal. Can you identify the SAM positions for targeting?" Sarah almost laughed at the question. Identifying the positions wasn't the problem. Surviving long enough to do something about them was. But even as another missile streaked past her aircraft, she was already forming a plan. It was dangerous, probably insane, but it might just work. "Jake, I need you to start painting targets with the laser. Every SAM site you can identify." "Are you crazy? We need to get out of here, not stick around for target practice." But Sarah's mind was working with the clarity that came in moments of extreme danger. She had studied the enemy's tactics for months, and she understood something that her weapons officer didn't. The surface-to-air missiles they were facing had limited numbers. Each site could only carry so many rounds, and they were already firing them as fast as they could reload. "Trust me, Jake. Paint every target you can find. Mike, I need you to follow my lead and be ready to engage on my command. Sarah, whatever you're planning, make it fast. I've got 2 more missiles tracking." Instead of climbing to escape the canyon, Sarah did something that defied every survival instinct she possessed. She turned the Apache toward the nearest SAM site and began a low-level attack run. The move was so unexpected that it caught the enemy missile operators off guard. The Apache's 30mm chain gun roared to life, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the cave where the first missile launcher was hidden. Sarah could see figures running from the position as her gunfire tore through their equipment. 1 SAM site down, at least 5 more to go. "Jesus Christ, Sarah. What are you doing?" Mike's voice carried a mixture of admiration and terror. "Something they won't expect," she replied, pulling up sharply to avoid ground fire from automatic weapons. "These guys planned for us to run away. They didn't plan for us to attack." The tactical situation was changing rapidly. By engaging the SAM sites directly, Sarah had forced the enemy to shift from a carefully orchestrated ambush to a chaotic, close-range firefight. The missile operators were no longer safely hidden in their caves. They were exposed and vulnerable to the Apache's superior firepower. Viper 2-1, this is base. We're seeing your engagement. Be advised, fast movers are en route to your position. ETA, 15 minutes. 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. Sarah and Mike would either win this fight in the next few minutes, or they wouldn't be around to see the Air Force jets arrive. But the knowledge that help was coming gave her the confidence to press the attack. Mike, take the sights on the east wall. I'll handle the west side. Copy that. Let's light these guys up. The two Apaches separated, each pilot focusing on their assigned targets. Sarah lined up her next shot and triggered a Hellfire missile, watching it streak across the canyon to explode against a cave entrance. The blast sent a shower of rocks cascading down the cliff face, and she knew another SAM site was out of action. But the enemy wasn't finished. As she pulled into a climbing turn, Sarah's threat warning system erupted in alarms. Someone had managed to get a missile lock on her aircraft, and this one was coming from directly ahead. There was no time for evasive maneuvers, no time for countermeasures. In that moment, Captain Sarah Martinez did something that would become legend among Army aviators. Instead of panicking, instead of desperately trying to escape, she laughed. It started as a chuckle, then built into full-throated laughter that transmitted clearly over the radio communications. Sarah, are you okay? Jake's voice was filled with concern and confusion. The laughter wasn't hysteria or fear. It was the sound of a pilot who had suddenly understood something fundamental about aerial combat. The enemy had sprung their perfect trap, fired their carefully planned ambush, and somehow managed to put themselves in a worse position than the helicopters they were trying to destroy. Jake, do you see what I see? She asked, still chuckling as she maneuvered the Apache with precision that seemed almost casual. Her weapons officer looked at his targeting display and suddenly understood. The incoming missile wasn't just locked onto their helicopter. Its trajectory would carry it directly into one of the remaining SAM sites on the opposite canyon wall. The enemy was about to shoot down their own position with a missile intended for the Americans. Are you going to? Jake started to ask. Oh, yes, Sarah replied, her laughter echoing over the communications frequency as she made a slight adjustment to their flight path. The missile streaked toward them, its guidance system locked onto the Apache's heat signature. At the last possible second, Sarah pulled into a violent turn that brought them inches from the canyon wall. The missile, unable to adjust its course quickly enough, slammed into the rocks behind them. The explosion was enormous. Not only did the missile detonate, but it triggered a secondary explosion from the ammunition stored in the SAM site hidden in that section of cliff. The blast brought down tons of rock, sealing the cave entrance and eliminating another threat. Did you just trick them into shooting themselves? Mike's voice carried a note of amazement. Basic physics, Sarah replied, still grinning inside her helmet. Missiles follow predictable flight paths. Sometimes, you just have to position yourself so that path goes where you want it to go. The tide of battle was shifting decisively in favor of the Apache crews. What had started as a carefully planned ambush was turning into a rout. The enemy's greatest advantage, their concealed positions, was becoming their weakness as the helicopter crews used the canyon's geography against them. But the fight wasn't over yet. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from automatic weapons positions scattered throughout the canyon, and her aircraft was taking hits from small arms fire. The Apache was heavily armored, but concentrated fire could still bring it down if they remained in the killing zone too long. Jake, I need continuous fire on those infantry positions while I maneuver us out of here. Her weapons officer didn't need to be asked twice. The chain gun began its steady hammering, laying down suppressive fire that forced the enemy soldiers to keep their heads down. Meanwhile, Mike was engaging the last of the SAM sites with both gunfire and missiles. The radio crackled with traffic as other aircraft began checking in. The fast-moving jets were still 10 minutes out, but a pair of Apache helicopters from another unit had heard the emergency call and were racing to assist. The cavalry was coming, but Sarah and Mike had already won the most important part of the battle. This is Viper 6-1. We're 5 minutes from your position. What do you need? Sarah looked around the canyon, assessing the tactical situation. Most of the SAM sites were destroyed or abandoned, and the enemy ground forces were either dead, wounded, or fleeing. The elaborate ambush had become a complete disaster for those who had planned it. Viper 6-1, this is 2-1. We've neutralized the primary threats, but we could use some help with cleanup. Multiple enemy personnel scattered throughout the canyon. As her laughter finally subsided, Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Not just because she had survived, but because she had proved something important to herself and to everyone listening on the radio. When faced with a perfect ambush, sometimes the best response wasn't to run, it was to attack with such ferocity and unpredictability that you turned the hunters into the hunted. The enemy had spent weeks planning this operation, positioning their weapons and personnel for maximum effect. They had studied American tactics, prepared for every likely response, and set up what should have been an inescapable trap. But they had made one crucial error. They had underestimated the skill, courage, and sheer bloody-minded determination of the Apache pilots they were trying to kill. Base, this is Viper 2-1. Canyon is secure. Enemy ambush defeated. Requesting battle damage assessment and medical evacuation for enemy wounded. Even in victory, Sarah maintained the professionalism that marked her as one of the Army's elite pilots. The enemy soldiers who had tried to kill her were still human beings, and those who had survived deserved medical treatment according to the rules of war. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning away the shadows that had concealed the enemy positions. In a few hours, intelligence specialists would arrive to examine the destroyed equipment and interrogate prisoners. They would want to know how such an elaborate ambush had been planned and executed, and how 2 Apache helicopters had managed to turn it into a complete victory. But for now, Captain Sarah Martinez was content to fly her damaged but still functional helicopter toward the safety of their forward base. Behind her, the canyon was quiet, except for the occasional secondary explosion as ammunition continued to cook off in the burning SAM sites. Her laughter had echoed over the communications frequency at the moment when defeat seemed certain, when enemy missiles filled the air and death appeared inevitable. It would be remembered by everyone who heard it as the sound of a pilot who refused to be intimidated, who found humor in the face of mortal danger, and who turned certain defeat into impossible victory through skill, courage, and the kind of fighting spirit that had defined combat aviators for generations. The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Phoenix was crowded with more officers than Sarah had ever seen in one place. Word of the canyon engagement had spread quickly through the military hierarchy, and everyone from intelligence analysts to general officers wanted to understand exactly how 2 Apache helicopters had defeated what should have been a perfect ambush. Sarah sat at the metal table, still wearing her flight suit, fatigue evident in her eyes despite the adrenaline that continued to course through her system. Across from her, Mike Rodriguez looked equally exhausted but somehow satisfied. They had been flying combat missions together for 8 months, but the events of this morning had created a bond that would last the rest of their lives. Captain Martinez, began Colonel James Harrison, the task force commander, I want you to walk me through your decision-making process one more time. When you realized you were in an ambush, what made you decide to attack rather than withdraw? Sarah had answered this question 3 times already, but she understood why everyone kept asking. Military doctrine emphasized the importance of withdrawing from unfavorable tactical situations, and her decision to press the attack had violated almost every rule in the book. The fact that it had worked didn't automatically make it the right choice. Sir, the enemy had positioned their SAM sites to cover all the obvious escape routes. They were firing missiles faster than we could evade them. My assessment was that trying to run would have gotten us killed, so I decided to do something they wouldn't expect. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, the intelligence officer, looked up from her notes. The after-action analysis shows that the enemy spent at least 2 weeks preparing this ambush. They had studied our flight patterns, identified our likely responses, and positioned their forces accordingly. How did you recognize It was a trap so quickly. Sarah thought back to those crucial moments when everything had seemed wrong about the convoy they were supposed to attack. It was hard to explain the instinct that had saved their lives, the accumulated experience that had warned her before any concrete evidence appeared on her instruments. The vehicles were moving too predictably, ma'am. In 8 months of flying these missions, I've learned that real convoys move erratically to avoid becoming targets. These trucks were following a route that seemed designed to draw us into the canyon at a specific altitude and heading. Jake Thompson, her weapons officer, spoke up from his position beside her. Captain Martinez saved our lives by trusting her instincts when everything else was telling us to engage. I've flown with a lot of pilots, and most of them would have followed standard procedure and fired on those vehicles. The assembled officers began discussing the tactical implications of the engagement, analyzing every decision and outcome with the clinical precision that characterized military debriefings. But Sarah found her attention drifting to the window, where she could see Apache helicopters on the flight line being prepared for the next day's missions. 3 hours ago, she had been fighting for her life in a narrow canyon, surrounded by enemy missiles and automatic weapons fire. Now, she was sitting in an air-conditioned room, drinking coffee, and explaining her actions to people who would never experience the split-second decisions that defined aerial combat. Captain. Colonel Harrison's voice brought her back to the present. I want to discuss the moment when you began laughing over the radio. Several people have asked me about that, and I have to admit, I'm curious myself. Sarah felt a slight flush of embarrassment. The laughter had been spontaneous, a reaction to the sudden realization that the enemy's own tactics could be turned against them. But explaining the humor in a life-or-death situation to people who hadn't been there was nearly impossible. Sir, I realized that the incoming missile was going to hit one of their own positions if I maneuvered correctly. After weeks of planning this elaborate ambush, they were about to destroy their own equipment with their own weapons. It struck me as ironic. The intelligence officer made a note in her file. The psychological impact of your laughter on enemy communications cannot be underestimated. We intercepted several radio transmissions where their commanders were asking what was happening, and their soldiers were reporting that the American pilots were laughing while under fire. It clearly had a demoralizing effect. Mike Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair. Sarah didn't plan the psychological warfare aspect. She was just reacting to a tactical situation that had become completely reversed. The enemy thought they were hunting us, but suddenly they were the ones being hunted. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering everything from ammunition expenditure to maintenance requirements for the damaged aircraft. Sarah answered each question professionally. But part of her mind was already focused on the next mission, the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that American pilots could adapt and overcome any threat. Finally, Colonel Harrison closed his notebook and looked directly at her. Captain Martinez, I want you to know that your actions today will be studied by military aviators for years to come. You took a situation that should have resulted in the loss of 2 aircraft and turned it into a decisive victory. The enemy lost 6 surface-to-air missile sites, 24 personnel, and a significant amount of equipment. More importantly, you've demonstrated that their ambush tactics can be defeated. As the officers filed out of the room, Sarah remained seated, trying to process everything that had happened. 8 months ago, she had been a newly assigned pilot, eager to prove herself in combat but uncertain about her abilities under pressure. Today's engagement had answered questions about herself that she hadn't even known she was asking. Jake stayed behind, settling into the chair beside her with a tired sigh. So, how does it feel to be a legend? Sarah looked at him with surprise. What do you mean? By tomorrow morning, every Apache pilot in the theater is going to know about the captain who laughed while enemy missiles were trying to kill her. You've just become the kind of story that gets passed down from one generation of pilots to the next. The thought was both flattering and uncomfortable. Sarah had never sought fame or recognition. She had simply wanted to do her job well and bring her crew home safely. The idea that her actions would be remembered and retold felt strange, as if they were talking about someone else entirely. I was just trying to survive. Jake. Everything else was just Her weapons officer smiled. That's exactly what makes you different from most people. When you're under pressure, you don't panic or freeze up. You start thinking about how to win. That's not a skill you can teach in flight school. Over the following days, Sarah began to understand what Jake had meant about becoming a legend. Pilots from other units found excuses to visit their base, hoping to meet the woman who had turned an ambush into a victory. Mission commanders started asking specifically for her crew when planning difficult operations. But perhaps more importantly, the enemy's tactics began to change. Intelligence reports indicated that they were abandoning their elaborate ambush strategies in favor of hit-and-run attacks that didn't require them to remain in fixed positions. The psychological impact of the canyon engagement had rippled through their command structure, forcing them to reconsider their entire approach to fighting American helicopters. A week later, Sarah found herself flying another mission over the same canyon where the ambush had taken place. The rock formations looked different now, scarred by explosions and littered with the debris of destroyed equipment. The caves that had hidden surface-to-air missiles were now empty, their entrances collapsed by secondary explosions. Brings back memories, Jake commented over the intercom as they flew past the spot where they had nearly died. Sarah studied the canyon through her targeting system, noting how peaceful it looked without missiles streaking through the air. Good memories or bad memories? Definitely good. That was the day I learned that my pilot was completely insane, but in exactly the right way. She laughed, the same spontaneous laughter that had echoed over the radio communications during the firefight. It felt good to laugh, to remember that even in the deadly serious business of aerial combat, there was room for humor and humanity. The Apache helicopter continued its patrol, its crew alert for any signs of enemy activity. But the skies over the canyon were quiet now, free of the surface-to-air missiles that had once made them so dangerous. The enemy had learned a hard lesson about the capabilities and determination of American pilots, and they had chosen to find easier targets elsewhere. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Captain Sarah Martinez reflected on how much her life had changed in the space of a single morning. She was still the same person, with the same responsibilities and the same commitment to bringing her crew home safely. But she now knew something about herself that she hadn't known before. When faced with an impossible situation, she wouldn't just survive, she would find a way to win. The radio crackled with routine communications from other aircraft in the area, pilots reporting their positions and mission status in the calm, professional voices that characterized military aviation. But underlying those routine transmissions was an unspoken understanding that had spread throughout the aviation community. The enemy could plan their ambushes, position their weapons, and set their traps with all the care and precision they could muster. But they were facing pilots who had been trained not just to fly and fight, but to think and adapt under pressure. They were facing people who could laugh in the face of death and turn certain defeat into impossible victory through skill, courage, and the kind of fighting spirit that had kept aviators alive in hostile skies for generations. The canyon ambush had been intended to prove that American helicopters were vulnerable, that careful planning and superior numbers could overcome technological advantages. Instead, it had proved the opposite. In the hands of skilled and determined pilots, the Apache helicopter wasn't just a weapon system. It was an instrument of victory, capable of defeating any threat through the application of tactics, training, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in any manual. As Viper 2-1 continued its patrol over the peaceful desert, Captain Sarah Martinez smiled inside her helmet. She had found her place in the long tradition of military aviators, and she had earned it through trial by fire in a narrow canyon, where laughter had echoed over the communications frequency at the moment when victory seemed impossible. The war would continue, with new challenges and new threats emerging from the endless cycle of conflict. But whatever the future brought, Sarah knew she was ready for it. She had learned something invaluable about herself and about the aircraft she flew, and that knowledge would serve her well in all the battles yet to come.